Sometimes things go wrong. And sometimes things just go terribly wrong. A crisis or a calamity will break into your life. As a result of this unwelcomed invasion is a thick fog. It weighs you down. You feel crushed. You can't bear the load. It takes away your voice. There are no words to express the pain of the weight that is crushing you. In the midst of this thick fog coming from a calamity or crisis is the inability to see clearly as well. You feel the weight. You can't see clearly. It just hurts. And in the moment of a situation like this, the only questions that seem to come are like, where is God in this? Why is God silent? Sometimes we're honest enough and we actually ask those questions out loud. Sometimes we feel that we're not allowed to say those things. We ask them, but we keep them to ourselves. A crisis and a calamity can come in all shapes and sizes. It can be experienced in loss. Perhaps there is a trial in your life. It will range. And it doesn't matter who you are, hardship is going to be on your pathway. You may have experienced times of great reprieve and blessing in which you can certainly compare yourself to others and say, I haven't had it as hard. But if we're honest, we all know what it is to feel crushed. We know what it is to feel the weight of a burden of affliction. When the mountain of a crisis comes crashing down, there is a debris of disaster surrounding us. It is horrible. And this is a part of life in a fallen world. But it's in those moments when we feel that God is not there, that God is not active, that He's not being kind to us, and everything seems to be going bad. In fact, you could say the bottom of life has fallen out. Where is God in those moments? Is He gone? Is He working? Where is God? I want to share with you this morning that He's there. He's always there. He's there in the hard times. He's there in the happy times. This leads us to a great doctrine that we as Christians need to talk more about. And we need to talk about it not just in an academic exercise, but something we cling to with all our might. It is called the doctrine of divine providence. Don't be scared by the term. Let me give it to you very simply. The doctrine of divine providence means that the sovereign purpose of God perpetually reaches every person, every place, and every particular. There is nothing in this universe. There is no person, there is no place, there is no particular detail, regardless of how small and minute it is, that the sovereign purpose of God is not at work in. God is at work. He is working in all things to His glory. When we say divine providence, another way of saying it is this: God is in control and He cares. That is the doctrine of divine providence. And I want to show you the doctrine of divine providence on display in probably the most stunning story in the Old Testament. At least it's one of my favorites. It is found in the book of Ruth. But I want you to notice the context in which this book was written. It's found in the very opening line of verse 1, where we read the words, "In the days when the judges ruled." This is talking about the time that is described in the previous book, the book of Judges. What were those times like? Well, maybe just look over a page to the book of Judges and the very last verse, verse 25 of chapter 1. "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." To live in the days of the judges was a very dark time. You had people doing what pleased themselves. That would not be a nice environment. That's not the place where you would go for a jog at night. That's not the place where you would just simply wander on down to a shop to pick up a few things. When you've got people around you who are living to do what they want and what pleases them without any restraints, and when you read the book of Judges and consider some of the dark and depraved deeds that people were doing during that time, that is a horrendous time to live in. In fact, if you lived in those times, you would come to some conclusion, and the conclusion would be, is there hope for this world? It's gone down the gurgler. Things are just terrible, nasty, and horrible. But there is a clue to the hope that we must hold on to. It's actually found in that last verse of the book of Judges. It says, "In those days there was no king in Israel." Now that's certainly describing the reason why there was no restraint, but it's not just doing that. It's preparing us for what's going to happen in 1 and 2 Samuel, where the greatest king of all will be born in Israel, King David. And God is going to make a promise to David that from him will come a descendant who will rule forever and ever. But here's the issue. How do you get from the dark days of the judges to a king like David? Enters the book of Ruth, conveniently located right between Judges and 1 Samuel. Interestingly, and this is just a footnote, in one of the Jewish canons, the book of Ruth is located in a different part. It's actually located right after the book of Proverbs. And it's fascinating, in Proverbs 31, you read about a virtuous woman. And that same Hebrew word is used in Ruth 2 to describe Ruth. It's as if they're saying, when you read about the most impressive and godly woman in Proverbs 31, we want to give you Exhibit A, Ruth. Wherever it is placed, we know it takes place in the middle of the stories of the judges and the kings. So what I want you to see in this book, and we're going to cover this over 4 messages, the next 4 Sundays, I want you to see that this book is filled with surprises. The surprising sovereign hand of God is going to do things that you just did not expect, and that is how God works. I also want you to see that this book is ultimately preparing the readers for the very last word of the book. And if you quickly go over, you will see, spoiler alert here, by the way, it's David. That's the very last word of this book. This book is ultimately about the preparation for King David. But another thing that we're going to see in this book is in the preparation of God's raising up of a Davidic dynasty from whom Christ will come. We have on record pain. We have on record hardship. We have on record trials. We have record of a calamity and a crisis and the raw emotion that comes with it. And what this book is designed to do for us is ultimately prepare us for the arrival of Christ. But what it does in the process of doing that is it speaks to us saying, Christian, behold your God. He's there and He cares. That is what the book of Ruth is all about. Let's begin with our very first point this morning. And I want to give you my 2 points up front. It's very simple to follow because we're going to walk through the narrative. I want you to see 2 unexpected works of God. And it's all going to fall under the heading of providence. That's what we're talking about. Remember, providence is God's sovereign purpose in which He is perpetually reaching all people, places, and particulars. God's providence is His control and care. But when it comes to God's providence, I want you to know that in our experience, His providence can be understood in 2 ways. There is what we call hard providence and happy providence. God's always in control, but sometimes it's going to be hard. Let's have a look at Ruth 1. Verses 1 to 5. An unexpected, hard providence. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The scene is set. Here is a little family from the little town of Bethlehem. But they're living at a time of real hardship. A famine has taken place. Now, we can't identify with these people here because we live in a time where our pantries are full. The shops aren't far away. We even have delivery these days. You can get your smartphone out and open up an app and you can have food at your front door. This family was living in a time where there was no food in the pantry. You couldn't go to the supermarket. There was no Uber Eats. It was a famine. And during famines, tough times occur. Desperate measures begin to happen. Crime begins to increase. It is a horrible experience. So this is the first glimpse of a hard providence. God's in it, but it's hard to see at this point of time because the fog is so thick. But it thickens. As a result of the famine that had come into Bethlehem of Judah, this certain man who had a wife and 2 sons is identified in verse 2. His name was Elimelech. The Lord is my king. God is my king is what his name means. The name of his wife was Naomi, which literally means sweetie. Good name for a wife. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. Note the emphasis there. The writer wants you to know where they've come from. But then he says they went into the country of Moab and remained there. It's possible that they went to Moab with the view of being there for a short period of time to gain some food so that at the appropriate moment when the famine broke, they could return back to Bethlehem. But things change. We are told that as they had moved to Moab, which interestingly enough was a place that was in opposition to Judah and Judah in opposition to them, they moved there to find food, and we are told that calamity continues to strike. The providence that is hard continues to get harder. Look at what happens in verse 3. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Horrifying. She is now a widow. She has lost her provider. But she still has her boys. And we are told, as you continue to read in this text, that they lived there in Moab for 10 years. At the start of that time period, her boys found wives. Mahlon and Chilion had married Orpah and Ruth. Does the story end happily ever after? We'll only go to verse 4 and look what happens. After living there for about 10 years, we read in verse 5, but both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Tragedy upon tragedy. Can you see the hardship that Naomi is going through? And this is only 5 verses in. This is certainly a reminder that hardship can come quickly. This was all unexpected. They didn't expect the famine. They didn't expect Elimelech to die. They didn't expect the boys to die. They did not expect that such a big move would result in the death of Naomi's husband and her sons. When hard things and horrible things happen, it's amazing how quick people are to jump in and tell you immediately what you should be doing in the midst of that hardship. It's also amazing how quick people are, while you're in the midst of a hardship, to actually tell you why it is going on, as if they have secret access to the divine providence of God. I'm struck by some early Jewish traditions that were very quick to explain why this happened. In some Jewish traditions, among some rabbis, they had said the reason why this happened was because Elimelech left the land. And because he left the land, God struck him down in judgment. That was an early Jewish tradition. Another early Jewish tradition also said, and the reason why Mahlon and Chilion died was because they left the land like their father, but not only did they leave the land, they also married women from Moab. And as a result of this, God struck them down. God judged them. The problem when we begin to explain why Elimelech left and then begin to question whether he should or should not have done this is the text doesn't say. And that's not the point of the text. The text is simply describing this is what happened. Whether Elimelech left for the wrong reasons or if he was simply being a responsible husband and father to say, there's no food in Bethlehem, there's food over there, and I don't want my children to starve, we're going over there. Whatever the reasons the author wants you to see, this is what happened. The lesson here, first of all, is when a hard providence happens, we don't always know why it happened. And we are wrong to jump on another person and try to fix their theology straight away and begin to explain to them why these things are going on. A hard providence breaks into a family from the little town of Bethlehem. The mountain of hardship has collapsed. An avalanche of adversity has surrounded them. They're in the heap. Naomi feels the thickness of that fog I described. She is weighed down. She can't see. And you're left asking, why? But we don't know yet. She didn't know at this point. What she did know was that this hardship was from the hand of the Lord. She's going to say later on in this passage that the Lord has dealt harshly with her. The Lord, the hand of the Lord, verse 13, has gone out against her. There, Naomi is acknowledging that even in this horrible hardship, it was God that was working. She understood divine providence. Now, we'll get to that in just a moment as to what she's getting at when she says that, but I want you to simply see that the events of verses 1 to 5 can simply be described as a hard providence. Now let's move to our second point, and this is where we get to the real heart of what's going on here in Ruth 1, and that is an unexpected happy providence. She is surrounded by hardship. She is crushed and weighed down. life looks like it is without hope. The bottom of her world has fallen out. Is God there? He is. But you have to look very closely. You have to look very carefully. Because when it comes to the providence of God, it's seen most clearly in hindsight. It's as if it's like what one Puritan said, when it comes to divine providence, you have to interpret it and read it the same way you read the Hebrew alphabet, and that is backwards. Look carefully in the midst of a hard providence, a happy providence that flows from this. I want you to see in verses 6 to 22 the first major scene of this book, and here we begin to see what God is doing in the midst of the heap. We have an unexpected providence. And this unexpected providence is displayed, unexpected happy providence is displayed by means of a sweetness. We need to remember that behind every frowning providence of God is a smile of sweetness. We may not see it in the midst of it. In the moment, we will not understand, but it's there. And that's what I want you to see in the next part of Ruth 1. What is God doing in the life of Naomi? Why? She's asking the questions, I'm sure. If only Elimelech decided to stay in Bethlehem, he wouldn't have died. My boys wouldn't have died. If we didn't move, if we just stayed, if we went somewhere else, none of this would have happened. But it did. And you can't change it. Let's look at this unexpected happy providence. It comes in the form of sweetness. And there is a sweetness to God's happy providence in our lives. This sweetness is seen in two areas. And I think these two areas are the two most common areas where we will actually see the sweetness of God's providence. When we are going through hardship, I know the fog is thick. I know the weight is heavy. But if we look carefully, God's sweetness in His providence is often expressed in two areas. Number one, in particulars, in little things that you can easily ignore, and also in people. Let's have a look at the sweetness of God's providence in the particulars. We read in verse 6, "Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited His people and given them food." Now, it'd be very easy to continue going, but I want you to notice a particular there that you miss so quickly. You know what that particular is? There's food. In the midst of all her hardship, God, in His providence, in His happy providence, has provided food. She has heard that there is now food back in Bethlehem. The famine is over. And it's so easy for us as we go back to our houses and we have so much food around us to assume that that is just always there. But did you realize that the full pantry you have has come as a result of God's happy providence? God's sovereign purpose has perpetually worked so that your cupboard is full. When you have a bowl of cereal, that bowl of cereal is there because God in His happy providence has allowed for you to have that bowl of cereal. When you have milk, when you have any meal, every little particular that comes is from God's hand. We ask God when bad things happen, "Where are you?" But when good things are happening, we're not saying, "You are here." When I'm able to have a glass of orange juice, am I able to recognize this orange juice is possible because of the providence of God? When an accident happens in a car, we might ask, why did that happen? But every time we drive and there is no accident, do we say the hand of God's providence got me from that place to that place today? Naomi is in a hard providence, but look at the happy providence, a sweetness seen in the particulars. Naomi, there's now food. It's the smile of God. It is the fingerprints of the divine touch to say, I am working. The providence of God is seen in particulars. Now, in order to connect us to our next point, I want to flow with the text here, look at what we see then in verses 7 to 14 before we look at the next aspect of the sweetness of God's happy providence. Naomi now sets out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law. The writing is on the wall. There is now food in Bethlehem, and that is where I'm from. That's where I need to go back. So we go. And naturally, Orpah and Ruth say, well, we're coming along with you. But as they get into this journey, which by the way is probably about 7-day walk, it's not super far away, as they enter into this journey, suddenly Naomi looks at the situation and thinks to herself, this is not going to be good for the girls. They're from Moab and they're widows. There's no hope for them back in Bethlehem. They're not going to be welcomed beautifully by the people. They're outsiders. They're not a part of the covenant community of God's people. So she looks at her girls and says to them, these daughters-in-law, I want you to turn back. I want you to go home. Go back to your mother's house. And she issues a blessing on them. May God be kind to you. You've been kind to me. You've been great girls. This has been a wonderful time these last 10 years, but go home. It will be better for you. You'll have more of a chance to get remarried. She kisses them, and they all cry. It's a very emotional scene. But they insist, no, we're coming with you. This obviously says a lot about Naomi. They insist that we're going to travel with you on this journey, but Naomi really is insistent here. She's lived more life. She understands it's not going to work out for you girls. You've really got to stay. And she insists in verse 11, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? And she goes, let's think about this. I'm not pregnant right now. There's no children going to be born from me, which you can wait for them to be your future husbands. And let's say that that was possible, that I could remarry right now, and that I could have children right now. Are you really going to wait for them to grow up and marry them? This is just not practical. There is nothing good for you in Bethlehem. Nothing is going to advantage you. You're going to be at a huge disadvantage. Girls, I strongly say to you, turn back. You're not coming with me to Bethlehem. As a result of this, Orpah naturally responds with a kiss of affection and departs. She listens to the strong counsel of her mother-in-law. But notice a change, and this is what leads us to our next point, and that is Ruth clung to her. The happy providence of God is seen in sweetness. The sweetness is experienced in particulars. It's in those little things that we can ignore and look past so easily. But the sweetness of God's happy providence is also seen in people. Sometimes when we find ourselves in a crisis or a calamity, we will do well by God's kind grace to look around at the people He has placed into our lives. It's amazing how many times when someone goes through a hardship, God will raise up people or a person to bring a sweetness into your life. That's what we see in those 2 words in verse 14. But Ruth. Oh, I know the debris of disaster is crashed upon her. I know Naomi is at the bottom of a heap of an avalanche of adversity. I know the fog is thick, but if she looks, there is a sweetness in God's providence by bringing a person into her life, and this person is Ruth. This is what we see in our final verses 15 to 21. And she said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts from you. What is going on in verses 16 and 17? Here we have the public profession of faith by Ruth saying, Yahweh is my God. I do not serve the gods of Moab. I serve Yahweh, the God of Abraham. He is my God. And where you go, Naomi, I'm going. Your people are now my people. I know I'm an outsider, but I trust in the one true God. That's what she's saying in these verses. She is declaring her public profession of faith in the one true God. Now, let me just say this for a moment. What does that say about Naomi? What do you mean? What does it say about Naomi? Where did Ruth hear about this stuff? Well, she had a mother-in-law who knew the one true God. Perhaps it says a little bit about her husband, we don't know, but she heard it from somebody. I think she certainly heard it from Naomi. Naomi had been an amazing witness those 10 years. Her daughter-in-law has come to know the living God. So Ruth says, I am a believer and I serve God and I'm with you. I'm going to be loyal to you. I am going to be faithful to you. I'm going to look out for you. You cannot get rid of me. As we continue to read in the text, I want you to see in verse 18 that after such a bold statement, I love what it says in verse 18, when Naomi saw that she was determined, she said no more. I'm not going to mess with you, Ruth. You are filled with conviction. In fact, I love what I believe is a beautiful description of Ruth. If you look at Proverbs 31 and verse 25, remember, Proverbs 31 is talking about the virtuous woman. And listen to what it says that the virtuous woman, the courageous, loyal woman of God does. Proverbs 31 and verse 25, strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come. She so knows the sovereign hand of God that yes, difficulties are ahead of us, but I laugh at that. That is not just some fake thing. That is a conviction that says, I will entrust myself to the providential hand of God. That is Ruth. Very impressive woman. But now see specifically the sweetness of God's providence in a person. Naomi is going to say in verse 20, when she and Ruth arrive back at Bethlehem, people are going to be stunned by the sight. 10 years has gone by and they look at Naomi and they say, well, life has been hard on her. Look, she looks so different. 10 years is a little while, but the trials and trauma that she's gone through has come out in her appearance, and people look at her as saying, is that Naomi? And then Naomi says in verse 20, do not call me Naomi, do not call me one who is sweet. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. She goes on to say, I went away full and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? Now, before I give you the main point there, what do you do when someone talks like that? When someone goes through hardship and they say, the Lord has dealt harshly with me. The Lord has brought calamity into my life. Let me just give you some pastoral counsel. Don't try to fix their theology straight away. Don't go in there and say, excuse me, God is always good and let's talk about his goodness right now. This woman is hurting. Love the person. Pray for the person. Don't try to fix them. But she's not entirely wrong though. I know she's not seeing the sweetness of God's providence, but did God bring that hardship into her life? He did. There's a purpose behind it, but we don't always know that purpose. Don't pretend, don't say God's judging you. Don't say, because you don't know that. You're not sovereign. We are servants of the living God. But I do want you to see something that's very easy to miss. As she expresses the hard providence that she's experienced, she's missing, and she will see it soon, the smile of sweet providence. And that is seen in a person, because even though she said, I left full and came back empty, did you notice the emphasis of verse 19? Let me read it with emphasis. I love it. Here she is saying, I'm empty, I've got nothing. Listen to this. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. What's going on? You're not alone. God in His sweetness has given you a person in your life, and that is Ruth. I know it doesn't take away from the hardship. I know it doesn't take away from the trauma, and we don't pretend it does, and we don't be callous that it does, but there is a sweetness of God's providence here, and I want you to see the sweetness. I want to summarize this in verse 22, because verse 22 summarizes these points. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite with her daughter-in-law with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. I want you to see in that final verse the unexpected happy providence of God, all concentrated in verse 22. Can you see the person of God's sweetness there? And Ruth was with her. And can you see the particular? They arrived back at Bethlehem when? At the beginning of barley harvest. What good timing! But as I close, let me close with this. Naomi experienced a hard providence. And it would be very easy and natural for us to ask, where is God in this? Why is this happening? And even though we cannot always answer that question, let me say this. If Elimelech did not decide to leave Bethlehem and go to Moab, Mahlon, one of their sons, would have never married Ruth. But if that never happened, Mahlon would have never died, and Ruth would have never been a widow. And if that never happened, Ruth would have never been willing to be loyal to Naomi and follow her back to Bethlehem. And if that never happened, she would have never got there right at the beginning of barley harvest, where she would happen to go into a field owned by a man by the name of Boaz, who just happened to be a relative of Elimelech. And if none of that happened, they just would have never have happened to have got married. And if Ruth had never happened to have married Boaz, they would have never happened to have had a son by the name of Obed, who would never have happened to have been the grandfather of David, who would have never been in existence, so that there would have been the messianic line of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. In verses 1 to 5 is a horrible providence. But was God there? He was. He was unfolding a purpose. My concluding point is this. When horrible things happen, when things happen in our life that are not good, and it's okay to say that, know and understand that God is working so that there will be an ultimate good. And that ultimate good is that you will be made into the image of Christ. So when there is a bit of providence in your life, seek God's grace to see the sweetness that may be behind it. Father, thank you for your perfect word. Give us the humility to embrace it and the passion to live it out. In Jesus' name, amen.